On February 23rd, AD 303, Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, chosen of Jupiter, proclaimed the death of Christianity. Every church in the empire was to be closed. Every Bible and sacred text was to be burnt. Every Christian of rank would be demoted. Any Christian freedman could be enslaved. Within hours, the great church of Nicomedia, Diocletian's capital, had been demolished. What would soon be known as the Great Persecution had begun. Diocletian's persecution was the most systematic Roman attempt to destroy Christianity. Besides demonstrating how and why the Roman state attacked the Christians, it illustrates the strengths and weaknesses of the empire at a critical point in its history, when worship of the old gods seemed like the surest path to unity. It also foreshadows, in interesting ways, the policies of Constantine and his successors. Diocletian had always presented himself as a protector of Roman tradition. An edict he issued in 295, for example, banned the Egyptian practice of sibling marriage, denouncing it as fit only for barbarians and beasts. 7 years later, Diocletian decreed that the new religion associated with the Persian prophet Mani was to be eradicated. The Manichaean elect, the leaders of the sect, were burned alive on pyres of their sacred texts. Their followers were either executed immediately or, if they belonged to a higher social class, were condemned to a lingering death in the mines. All this was done, the emperor proclaimed, because it was utmost depravity to change the doctrines set down by our ancestors. The stage was set for a confrontation with the Christians. To worshippers of the traditional gods, the Christians had always seemed strange. Their belief in a single God who forbade the worship of all others was baffling. Their refusal to take part in the festivals and sacrifices that honored the gods seemed antisocial, and even, since those gods protected the emperor and empire, treasonous. During the early imperial era, popular distrust had occasionally boiled into anti-Christian pogroms. But it was only in the mid-3rd century, during the reign of the short-lived emperor Decius, that the first systematic persecution took place. Decius ordered every inhabitant of the empire to sacrifice to the gods for the safety of the Roman state and its ruling dynasty. A date was set by which every resident of a given city or district was to sacrifice. Altars were erected in the city centers, and long lines of men and women formed in front of them. As each suppliant came forward, he or she placed a sliver of meat on the altar fire, poured a libation, and tasted the sacrificial meal. The local commissioners then issued a signed certificate confirming the sacrifice. Though not originally intended to target the Christians, the universal sacrifice developed into a Christian witch hunt. Any Christian who refused to perform the ritual was taken into custody to await trial by the provincial governor. Many were exiled. Some were executed. The Decian persecution created a precedent for a more aggressive association of imperial power with traditional religion, and amid the many crises of the 3rd century, which seemed to suggest that the gods had withdrawn their favor from the Romans, it was easy to pin blame on the rapidly growing Christian community. But it was only with Diocletian's persecution that the full might of the Roman state was hurled against the Christians. According to Lactantius, a Christian professor of rhetoric, Diocletian was incited against the Christians by his junior co-ruler, Galerius. Reluctant to proceed, he consulted the oracle of Apollo at Didyma for advice. The god's response convinced the emperor to issue his edict. The date chosen for the edict's proclamation was the ancient festival of Terminalia. Messengers carried the edict throughout the provinces. Within a month, churches were being demolished in Palestine. By the beginning of summer, Christians were being questioned at Carthage, 1,000 miles from Nicomedia. From the beginning, the Great Persecution was much more severe in the eastern provinces, which were under the direct control of Diocletian and Galerius, than it was in the West. The junior emperor Constantius, father of Constantine, was especially unenthusiastic and seems to have done little to enforce the edict in Britain, Gaul, and Spain. Matters were different in the East. At Nicomedia, Diocletian presided personally over the trial and execution of dozens of Christians in the imperial service. A second edict was issued, ordering the arrest of priests and bishops. The prisons were soon crowded with clergy, who were tortured until they agreed to sacrifice to the traditional gods. There was a short respite later in the year when the overcrowded prisons were cleared in anticipation of Diocletian's 20th anniversary celebration. The following spring, however, yet another edict went out through the eastern provinces, ordering the inhabitants of every city and town to sacrifice to the gods. In the spring of 305, Diocletian retired. Galerius took his place as senior emperor and appointed his nephew Maximinus junior emperor in the east. Maximinus was a devout worshipper of the old gods. Like Julian a half-century later, he tried to strengthen traditional polytheism by creating a version of the Christian church hierarchy, with professional high priests responsible for the temples of every province. To discredit the Christians, he ordered the distribution of the Acts of Pilate, which portrayed Jesus as a common criminal. Maximinus redoubled the persecution in the provinces under his control, organizing new rounds of communal sacrifices. In 309, he ordered items for sale in the markets to be sprinkled with sacrificial blood so that Christians could not touch them. Anyone who entered the public baths, likewise, was to be spattered with droplets of blood and wine from temple rituals. The barrage of anti-Christian measures began to exhaust even believers in the traditional gods. In some cities, there was growing sympathy for the victims of the persecution, sometimes to the point that local officials were compelled to move executions of Christians into the countryside, lest they cause unrest. The persecution ground on, however, until the spring of 311, when Galerius, now dying of cancer, issued an edict of toleration. He did not apologize to the Christians, who had abandoned the ways of their ancestors, but he admitted that few Christians had returned to the traditional gods, despite every attempt to compel them. So they would be permitted to assemble and worship as long as they do nothing to disturb the peace. He concluded, plaintively, by asking the Christians to pray to their God for his safety. Maximinus issued his own edict of toleration the next year, which was followed soon after by Constantine's famous Edict of Milan. The Great Persecution was over. Although hard numbers are elusive, many Christians had died. Many more had been tortured, mutilated, enslaved, sent to brothels, or exiled. The unity of the Christian community had been badly shaken, especially in North Africa, where the persecution started a schism that would last for centuries. In political terms, Diocletian's persecution was nothing more or less than an analogue of Constantine's Council of Nicaea, an attempt to strengthen the Roman state by harmonizing its religious practices. The persecution had, however, far-reaching consequences that Diocletian could never have envisioned. Exiles driven by the persecution into the Egyptian desert, for example, helped to create the first Christian monasteries. Resistance to the Roman authorities infused Christianity with a sense of purpose and resolve in the crucial years just before the conversion of Constantine. Those who were executed became heroes. Even today, the Coptic and Ethiopian churches use the era of the martyrs, which dates all events from the accession of the great persecutor Diocletian. I hope you enjoyed today's video. On my series, Rome in Review, exclusively on Patreon, I plan to release a new video on the 1963 film Cleopatra, one of the most expensive and most misguided historical movies ever made. You'll find a link to my Patreon in the description. If you would like to join me on one of my group tours to Turkey, Greece, or Rome, check out the Toll & Stone Trips page, also linked in the description. And if you just can't get enough Toll & Stone content, Scroll a bit further down for links to my other YouTube channels. Thanks for watching.